know that Nederburg was the estate to bottle South Africa's very first noble late harvest wine? Now, they'd been making sweet wines in Constantia for centuries, but they'd never really embraced the botrytized style. And so it was that the then cellar master Günter Brosel in 1969 vinified South Africa's very first noble late harvest, inspired, of all things, by the botrytized wines that he'd encountered in California. But, and this is the little twist in the tale, the sugar levels in this noble late harvest wine far exceeded the allowed limit by the then Wine and Spirits Board of the day. And so, Nederburg was not allowed to sell this wine in a retail setting. The loophole, and there always are loopholes, is that they could sell the wine in an auction setting. And so it was that the annual Nederburg Wine Auction was born in 1975, and it is still going strong almost 50 years later. But while Nederburg may well be pioneers in the areas of wine auction and noble late harvest wines, perhaps a more relevant point of difference to ponder is the fact that Nederburg has one of the longest uninterrupted track records for delivering really very well made, age-worthy Cabernet Sauvignons and Cabernet Sauvignon-based Bordeaux blends. Nederburg has been producing wines of this style since the mid-1960s. And today's hand drink solo wine of the day is exactly such a wine, the Nederburg Heritage Heroes Brewmaster 2019. The Brewmaster is part of a range of wines called the Nederburg Heritage Heroes. And the Heritage Heroes was developed in order to celebrate a few key members in the Nederburg story. The name Brewmaster refers to a German immigrant called Johann Grau, who bought the farm, literally, in 1937. For those interested, he metaphorically bought the farm in 1959. But before he did that, he was the man to introduce cold fermentation to the winemaking processes at Nederburg. And this was a huge step forward for them in the level of wines that they were producing. He was also South Africa's first viticulturist to really look closely at clonal selection as a means through which to improve wine quality. A point to note here is that Johann Grau was really just one man in a fairly long line of influential characters at Nederburg. Günter Brosel, a man who became Nederburg's cellar master a little after Johann Grau, became the first winemaker to bring back the IWSC's Robert Mondale, the International Winemaker of the Year award. He won that in 1985. And outside of that, Nederburg is also one of the very few producers in South Africa to have earned the title of Platter's Producer of the Year more than once. Most recently, they did that in 2017. The reason I labor the point about Nederburg's influence is because this long line of individuals were not once-off flukes, but rather they were cogs in a rather well-oiled wine machine. And that wine machine continues to operate really well to this day. As I've said in other videos, the top end of the Nederburg catalog, especially on the red wine side, is packed full of some superb Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Sauvignon-based Bordeaux blends. And these wines do South Africa proud on the global stage quite regularly. But what of this wine, you might ask? Well, let's get into the glass and see. The first thing to note is that it is 2/3 Cabernet Sauvignon, mostly from the warmer region of Paarl. Secondly, it's backed up by dollops of Petit Verdot and Malbec. And interestingly, these last two components are both incredibly rich in color and have fairly low levels of pyrazines. That set of characteristics is ideal for crafting a wine that requires a high level of pop sensibility. When we give this wine a sniff, well, for starters, it smells expensive. I mean, it has everything you might want from a fancy wine. It's got this lovely, rich fruit element, both red and black fruit packed in there, and this is all wrapped in some quite rich oak spice. And if we were to dig down and be a little more specific, there's ripe black currant up front, and then that is interwoven with cedar, and then there are fresher red currant and red cherry notes, which in turn have those notes of pencil shavings in amongst them. To finish it off, there is still that cab-driven hint of thyme or Mediterranean herbs, which is quite lovely. When we take a sip, well, that really is pure pop rock. It is a supremely polished wine, which, as I said earlier, has pretty much everything you could want from a opulent New World Bordeaux blend. There is that ripe, clean fruit in a number of guises, both red and black, and this is wrapped up in a tasteful use of oak. The black currant I mentioned on the nose follows through onto the palate, but there's also a richer, quite concentrated sort of black currant fruit pastel element, which is something that I often associate with Petit Verdot. And then there are also some quite lovely Mediterranean herbal elements, a little bit of thyme, which I, again, often pick up on Cabernet Sauvignon. But those riper black fruit notes are not left on their own. They're kind of held upright by much fresher, more vibrant red fruit notes of red cherry and red currants. And then when we get onto the oak, we do get that cedar spice, we get a little bit of licorice, and if we're to discuss the tannins, well, they are ridiculously silky, although they're still present, especially on the finish, where they almost take the form of a sort of cherry skin texture. Okay, so that's all we have time for today, but if you have more questions about Nederburg, then drop them into the site and I will try and get back to you as soon as possible. And if you enjoyed the video, then support us on Patreon and subscribe to the Handling Solo YouTube channel, where we publish at least 6 videos each month talking about wine science, wine history, unusual wine cultivars, and some of the dynamic winemaking stars that are coming out of the South African winelands.